There was a time when walking to school didn't require a GPS or a tracking device or a watch. Just your backpack, sneakers, your lunch bag, and off you go. The streets were quieter and the houses looked like they belonged in a sitcom. But there was something oddly freeing about being able to walk to school by yourself. Except for one big thing, the big scary world lurking just beyond the familiar. Oh, and I was 5 years old. Each school day, I would walk from my house to kindergarten. I was 5 years old, and my parents' only rule was don't talk to strangers. But there are other dangers lurking about in the neighborhood. And again, I was 5 years old, so I was afraid of everything. But it was normal for all of us in the neighborhood to walk to school when you're 5 years old. It's what we did in the late 70s and 80s. For myself, the scariest part of walking to school is when I encountered a dog. Now, it didn't matter if the dog was on a leash, behind a fence, I was still scared. And I was a crybaby. Right? 5-year-old little me walking to school. I would see a dog that could have just been 100 yards away paying no attention to me. I'd already start getting tears in my eyes, get the waterworks going, and start crying because I think the dog's going to notice me and start running across and attack me. Okay? I would also see dogs that were on leashes and their owners walking them. And I would freak out because I would think, well, that dog's going to break loose and come attack me. I would even freak out where a dog is in his yard behind a fence taking a crap. And I would be scared of that. Okay. Waterworks, just start bawling. Okay. Yeah, I was a wuss, but I was 5 years old. I was also very afraid of thunderstorms. So when I had to walk home from school, I remember one time, huge thunderstorm, lightning, crack of thunder, and then the rain's hitting me, and I'm 5 years old holding my little book and my lunch pail, and I'm walking home, and I'm just crying. And I saw a postman walking, and I thought, well, maybe, yeah, don't talk to strangers, but maybe he can at least give me some consolation. It was just nice to see that someone else is walking out in the storm. And typical 70s, this was actually around 78 or so, people were pretty stern, pretty just dry, direct, to the point, okay? In the 70s and 80s, we were pretty hard. So the postman just looked at me and said, stop your crying, make your way home. That was the postman. And you know what? That's how it was in the late 70s and 80s. I mean, us Gen Xers, like I said, we were pretty hard because we lived through these 70s and 80s. When I tell my daughters this story, they just can't believe that my parents would let a 5-year-old or a child walk to school by themselves a half mile. But that's what we did in the 70s and 80s. I mean, I wouldn't have my daughters do that, and I never did. There's a little bit more safety precautions going on, but back in the 70s and 80s, that's what we did. And again, parents would probably be just thinking that's absurd to be doing. And yeah, maybe so, but you know what? It actually did bring about some resilience on us. All right, it did make us what they call, being hard, even though we're little kids. But you deal with situations and you find a way past it, and it just made you more resilient. And one last note about being raised in the 70s and 80s, and I try to instill this onto my daughters. I always tell everybody I raised my daughters 80s style, even though they were raised in the early 2000s. But being raised in the 70s and 80s, you're out on your own quite a bit. It allowed you to take on independence and gain a lot of confidence. One last little story. When I was walking home and I was scared, I would often put rocks in my pocket and thinking if I had rocks in my pocket, if I ran into any issues or a scary person or a stranger or a dog, I could take out these rocks and throw them. Back then, my mind was stronger than my physical fortitude. I couldn't really throw a rock that fast or that far or that accurate, but just knowing I have rocks. So I would walk home and I would find rocks and I would put them in my pocket. I remember one time I'm walking home and there was a guy. He was in his car, in his garage, working on something, and he couldn't grab a wrench or something like that. Tried calling for his wife, and I remember I was approaching his garage. I was on the sidewalk, and his garage was on the side there. I remember just kind of looking at him, and again, 5 years old. It's amazing what you remember. And he couldn't get his wife's attention, And he looked at me and he said, "Hey kid, can you come inside here and grab the wrench and give it to me?" And of course, that's a big no-no. You don't do that. I remember just being kind of freaked out at him, and I started grabbing a rock out of my pocket. And then he finally called for his wife, and his wife came over. And I was like, wow, I was that close to chucking a rock. Probably wouldn't have done it, but it did make me feel safer, and I had confidence because I had pockets full of rocks.